Well, it was in my childhood days. Oh Lord, many long years ago. Now with the Spirit, now of my Savior, I was filled, Lord filled, oh, in that old fashioned meeting. Oh Lord, I'm memories, they linger still in that little, oh, that wooden church house out on a hill.
In October 2010, Pat Sermons Miller brought into my office a collection of vintage documents and photos that she discovered in an old trunk in the attic of a home she inherited. She was just going to burn them, but her friend advised her otherwise. The home was the original homestead of Pat's third great-grandfather, Hardeman Sermons. It is located at the end of Sermons Road, just north of Ray City, Georgia. The collection included a leather wallet with $2.70 in Georgia state currency, plus numerous photos and papers documenting the life of Hardeman Sermons and his family through 3 or 4 generations. Among the papers was the commission of Hardeman Sermons as a second lieutenant in the Georgia militia in 1860 by Governor Joseph Brown, and 2 Union Army muster rolls from the Civil War. Also among these highly collectible documents was this one small bluish cast piece of paper dated 1856. It was a bill of sale from James Dobson to Hardeman Sermons for 2 slave boys. One of the boys was named Peter, age 13 years, and the other was named Dick, age 11 years. The sale price in 1856 for the 2 slave boys was $1,900. That's $60,000 in today's purchasing power. But the Union muster rolls received the most attention because the director of the National Archive in Morrow, Georgia, wanted the documents for their exhibit featuring the 150th anniversary of the start of the Civil War. It was over a year later when Barbara Marsh from North Charleston, South Carolina, was in Nashville researching her McGowan family history. She was directed to the courthouse to see if I could help her in some way. I was out of the office, and she was on her way back home and could not stay any longer in Nashville. When I got back to the office, my wife told me a black lady had been there looking for information regarding her great-grandfather, who was the slave for Hardeman Sermons. I suddenly recalled seeing that bill of sale of 2 slave boys who had been purchased by Hardeman Sermons among the documents that were part of the collection that Pat Miller had donated to the Historical Foundation over a year earlier. I called Mrs. Marsh that evening at her home, and she said her family tradition was that they were descendants of a slave whose name was Richard McGowan, but his family called him Dick. He and his brother Peter were slaves on the Sermons plantation. I pulled out the bill of sale and read through it out loud to Mrs. Marsh over the phone. 2 Negro boys, one named Peter, the other named Dick. Mrs. Marsh, I'm holding in my hands the bill of sale of your great-grandfather. Mrs. Marsh, clearly touched by this revelation, asked if Pat Miller was a descendant of Hardeman's sermons. I told her she was his 3rd great-granddaughter. She replied, I would really like to meet her. I feel like we are related in some ways. This call, along with the information contained in the bill of sale, set in motion a research project that was the most in-depth search I had ever attempted with an African American descendant. My first clues came from the Huxford Bible, so to speak, and the 1860 census. The Pioneers of Wiregrass, Volume 5, gave a brief biography of James Dobson, 1801-1874, of Berrien County. Therein it states that Mr. Dobson had moved to Berrien County in 1850 from Duplin County, North Carolina. The census records concurred. My search switched to Duplin County, North Carolina. Out of anxious curiosity, I did a search for any white McGowans in Duplin County, with Kenansville being the county seat. There were several McGowans residing in Duplin County in 1850. I used usgenweb.com to see what the earliest white McGowan marriage date was. William McGowan was married in 1769. This appeared to be one of the first McGowan marriages in the county, and likely one of the early McGowan slave owners. Also on usgenweb.com, there was a history of the McGowan family spelled with an A instead of an E. It stated that William McGowan Sr. was an immigrant from Scotland or Northern Ireland and had 2 sons, George and William Jr. William McGowan Sr. made no mention of any slaves in his will, so it can be assumed that he had none to pass along. William Jr. most likely purchased his slaves at the slave market in Fayetteville, just 50 miles away from Kenansville. The McGowan history continues with the names of William Jr.'s wife and children. It also stated that John McGowan was named the executor of his father's will in 1792. Would I be fortunate enough to find the will of William McGowan Jr.? I was in luck. There was a will for William McGowan Jr., and it was a digital online image of the entire will. It also had been transcribed in readable form. It was interesting that he signed his name as William McGowan. In the second bequest of his will, William McGowan Jr. stated that after all of his debts were paid, his son John was to take possession of his personal manslave named Will. In the ninth bequest in the will of William McGowan Jr., it states, I lend to my said wife during her natural life 1 Negro boy named Dick, and 1 Negro girl named Nancy, and at her decease to be divided amongst my children, John excepted. So was the slave named Will the father of the Negro boy named Dick? And is Dick the grandfather of Richard McGowan? In the 11th bequest in the will of William McGowan, Jr., it states, "My will is that all the Negroes not already mentioned in this will, together with the stock of all kinds and household and kitchen furniture, be and remain with my wife for the purpose of raising and schooling my young children." In 1790, the slave population of Duplin County was less than 30%. Over half of the white population had no slaves, and most who had slaves had fewer than 10, usually just 1 or 2. The largest slaveholder in the county had 45 slaves. So how many slaves did William McGowan Jr. own? The 1800 census lists his 3 sons, John, Robert, and William III, and William Jr.'s wife, Mary, being the only McGowan families living in Duplin County and owning 32 slaves between them. The 1810 census lists his 3 sons, John, James, and William III, and William Jr.'s wife, Mary, still being the only McGowan families living in Duplin County and owning the same 33 slaves between them. However, by 1820, only William III was living in the county with just 2 slaves. So who were Richard McGowan's parents? The answer may be in the 1866 Freedman marriage record, where Thomas McGowan, who was the only black McGowan living in Duplin County, who was the right age, was cohabitating with Malvina McGowan since 1826. By 1850, William McGowan III had only 1 slave. One of his sons, James, had 3 slaves, and the other son, Joseph, had 26 slaves. It is most likely that sometime prior to 1850, James Dobson purchased the McGowan slaves from William or one of his sons. The 1850 slave schedule showed James Dobson owning 6 slaves, a 27-year-old female and 5 males, ages 12, 10, 8, 6, and 2. The 8-year-old was Peter McGowan, and the 6-year-old was Richard Dick McGowan. Shortly after the 1850 census was taken in Duplin County, James Dobson and his family, along with his 6 slaves, moved to Lowndes County, Georgia, northeast of Ray City. By early 1856, in now Berrien County, Dobson was taxed on the value of 7 slaves. Later that year, on November 11th, 1856, after his property was taxed, James Dobson sold 2 of his slave boys, Peter, age 13, and Dick, age 11, to Hardeman Sermons for $1,900. In the 1860 slave schedule, Hardeman Sermons had 3 slaves, a 25-year-old mulatto male, and Peter McGowan, now listed as age 16, and Dick McGowan, now listed as age 14. With the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, Hardeman Sermons enlisted in the Confederate Army with the Clinch County Grays, but spent most of the war in South Georgia patrolling the southern counties in search of deserters. Dick continued to work on the Sermons farm throughout the war. In 1867, Richard McGowan, now a freedman, paid a poll tax and registered to vote. Therefore, being required to sign an oath of allegiance, as were all Southern voters. Note that he signed the oath with his X mark, as he could not read or write. In the first census after the Civil War, Richard McGowan and another black, Tony Smith, are still working as farm laborers at the Hardeman Sermons plantation. Dick is listed aged 23, which is close to the 1845 estimate of his birth date from the 1856 Bill of Sale. By 1880, Richard had married Sally Thomas and had started their family with the births of Billy, Jesse, Henry, Aaron, and Minerva. Richard, aged 30, probably 34, and Sally, 25, were still living near the Sermons and Knight family farms, but in a separate household. The 1900 census shows Richard and Sally still residing in the Rays Mill district. Richard said his age was 66, actually 55, and Sally was age 55, actually 45, and had 10 of her 13 children still living. His son Jesse and family were living next door. In 1910, the McGowan household consisted of Richard, age 62, actually 65, Sally, age 52, actually 55, and 3 of their 8 surviving children. The McGowans were renting a home about 6 miles east of Ray City and just north of Highway 129, working as wage employees. In that same census, Richard's son Jesse was a widower residing in a rented home near Milltown with his 3 sons, Sampson, Fillmore, and Joe. His brother Aaron, the grandfather of Mrs. Marsh, was married, living and sharecropping in Valdosta. In the 1920 census, Richard was enumerated as Dick McGowan, age 76, and still renting in the Ray City area, farming and living with Sally, 64, his daughters Maggie and Fanny, and a granddaughter, Flory. Richard McGowan lived long enough in 1930 to be enumerated in the census and living near Ray City. He died in August at the home of his grandson, Fillmore, in Ray City. He is buried at the St. John Church in Barretts. Ray City, Georgia, August 6. Georgia Negro, 106, dies in Ray City. Uncle Dick McGowan, a Negro man believed to be Berrien County's oldest resident, died near here. He was 106 years of age. McGowan was known to have been a slave owned by the late Hardy Sermons of Ray City. This erroneous news item ran in the Georgia Constitution on August 7, 1930. However, the 1920 census states he was 76 years old, and the 1930 census states his age just before he passed away as 99 years old. But in fact, being born in 1845, his actual age was closer to 85. Fillmore, Richard's grandson, married Molly Reddick, a noted psychic in Ray City, in 1928. He was 24, she was 44. In 1930, they were living in their own home in Ray City. He was listed as a farmer. She was listed as a healer by birthright. Also in 1930, Aaron McGowan, age 53, Mrs. Marsh's grandfather, was living and still farming in Valdosta near the Valaton Dairy, where he owned property. Her mother, Joella, was 13 years old. Fillmore M. McGowan, sometime between 1941 and 1942, registered for the World War II draft. He stated he was 40 years old, living in Ray City at the time, though his actual age was probably 38. He did not serve in the war. In 1946, Aaron McGowan, son of the slave boy Richard McGowan, passed away in Valdosta, Georgia, and is buried at the Sunset Hills Cemetery. In 1981, Fillmore McGowan, grandson of the slave boy Richard McGowan, passed away in Ray City, Georgia, and is buried at the Charles Knight Cemetery in Lakeland. Though Richard McGowan and his wife Sally never learned to read or write during their lifetime, their children and their many descendants have been well educated and very successful in their many professional pursuits. It was the lifelong search by Barbara Marsh to know who her slave ancestors were, and Pat Miller's thoughtful gift of her own family's heritage that finally revealed the history of Richard McGowan, slave boy. Every 2 years, Barbara tries to arrange for her many cousins to come together for a grand reunion. She could not think of a better occasion to share the Richard McGowan story with her family. So in August 2013, Barbara Marsh invited Pat Miller and me as her special guests to attend the Richard McGowan Family Reunion Dinner held at the Rainwater Convention Center in Valdosta. And there, after over 150 years of history, the lives of these two separate but very much intertwined families were united once again, not as slave or slaveholder, but in a common spirit of honor and respect. But that is not the end of the story. In 2014, Barbara made a 4-hour drive to Kenansville, North Carolina, where she met for the first time her McGowan cousins, whose slave families had remained in Duplin County. There, she was welcomed with open arms as the long-lost prodigal daughter that she was. But the highlight of her trip was when she visited the McGowan African American Cemetery, where so many of her early slave ancestors are buried. So after 76 years, she was able to share her story of Dick McGowan, the slave boy, and proudly proclaimed, "I know my American roots, and I have come home."
In that little, that one church house,